Thank you very much, Jill. Thanks for your initiative, for your consistently principled voice, and for organizing this and inviting me to participate. Also to your colleague, Mark Alborno, who's done so much to make it happen. It's an honor to be here with all of these great voices that are on the panel. And let me just express at the outset my solidarity with the people of Palestine, those of you who are watching or listening today, and my deference to your agency. We have heard your calls to the international community in today's discussion as a way to look at one option for responding to that belated response. So we know after 2 years of genocide that the genocide, the apartheid of the Israeli regime is only going to end through resistance against the regime, the steadfastness of the Palestinian people, the solidarity of the rest of the world, and the isolation and ultimately dismantling of the Israeli regime. That was the case in South Africa. This is a long struggle, as was the case in South Africa, and we need to all be in it for that long struggle. But the question that always comes up is, what can we do now? What can we do right now? And we know, all of us who are involved in this struggle, the essential role that boycott and divestment and sanctions and demonstrations and disruption and civil disobedience, the education work that we do, prosecutions under universal jurisdiction, civil cases, all of those things can be happening right now. But we can also respond to the Palestinian call for intervention from the international community through this mechanism mentioned by Jill, a Cold War era resolution that was adopted in 1950 called Uniting for Peace, that authorizes the UN General Assembly to act when the Security Council is blocked by the veto of one of its members. And under this mechanism, which has been used several times in the past, but usually only for symbolic resolutions, this time the UN could mandate a UN protection force that would deploy to Palestine specifically to protect civilians, ensure humanitarian aid, preserve evidence of Israeli crimes, and assist in recovery and reconstruction. And most important here, it could help to change the political incentive structure under which Israel and its complicit US partner are currently operating with impunity. Now, Jill mentioned this upcoming deadline that's been set by the UN General Assembly last year for Israeli compliance with the orders of the International Court of Justice, and with a promise of further measures to be adopted in the wake of non-compliance. That provides us a very particular moment for action. We know intervention is long past due, but this is a real opportunity to shine a light on this initiative. Now, I want to say there are a lot of models of intervention, and I have said in the past that given the genocide that's underway in Palestine, any country can legally intervene, either individually or collectively with others, to take action to stop the genocide. And indeed, it's an obligation under the Geneva Conventions and under the Genocide Convention for states to do so. They are legally obliged to do so. But of course, no country has done so, with the exception perhaps of the Ansar Allah government in Yemen. All of the others have stood essentially idly by when it comes to the question of intervention. And one of the ways that they can be encouraged to act is to give them an international mandate to do so. And that's why a multilateral mandate from the United Nations can provide those states, which, as Jill said, there is a supermajority. There's more than 2/3. Most of the world is actually aligned with Palestine and against this genocide. But if we provide them with a multilateral mandate that gives them the legal and political and diplomatic cover that many of them require, we have a better chance of encouraging the kind of intervention that we want. Now, here, I want to caution everyone who is listening. There are many proposals for intervention. Some of them are not about protection for the Palestinian people, let alone their liberation. Some of the resolutions that are circulating contain no protection at all, just another rhetorical call for a ceasefire and humanitarian aid and the release of hostages, but no concrete measures to actually change the situation on the ground. Others have called for civilian monitors for Gaza. Imagine a few dozen observers in blue vests with clipboards and radios. But there have been human rights monitors on the ground in Palestine for decades, including currently, and they perform valuable work, but they have no deterrent effect. They can't help to facilitate the delivery of aid, and the Israeli regime views them as no impediment at all to its actions in Palestine. There are other proposals, like the French and Saudi proposal, calling for a so-called stabilization force. But the details of that proposal suggest that such an intervention would not be designed principally to protect the Palestinians from the Israeli regime, but rather to keep an eye on the Palestinian resistance, to renormalize the Israeli regime, even as it perpetrates a genocide, and then to restore the very cruel status quo that existed before October of 2023 with the caging of the Palestinian people. And I have to say this as well. There is a real effort to distract attention away from ending the bloody genocide that's happening right now in Palestine by shifting the conversation to a two-state solution or recognition of a Palestinian state. That's not solidarity, that is complicity. Yes, recognize a Palestinian state, but the order of the day is protection in the face of genocide. A lot of the proposals that have been put forward seem to be intended to try to resume the process of normalization of the Israeli regime and to resuscitate the ruse of Oslo. And we know that a return to an Oslo 2.0 will just be another smokescreen for Israeli impunity, where Palestinians are told they have to negotiate for their rights with their oppressor, as their rights and lands are continuously eroded and the regime status more and more normalized. That cannot be the answer. And then, of course, there is the sick and twisted proposal of Donald Trump for a direct U.S. occupation, ethnic purging, privatization, and a techno-colonial domination of Gaza, revealing once again the dangerous and deeply racist delusions of the U.S. empire. And finally, the Israeli regime itself has suggested the deploying of a proxy occupation force manned by forces from friendly Arab states that collaborate with the regime. As is, I think, self-evident, these proposals are not about ending genocide and apartheid. They're about entrenching them. So what is needed then is a human rights-based assessment that rejects any of those options and instead brings us to the United Nations. Now, that deadline that was set last year by the General Assembly for Israel to comply with the demands of the International Court of Justice is a deadline for further measures to be adopted. And as you can see in the diplomatic activity in New York, Western delegations are scurrying to stop those further measures from being adopted and to change the focus away from Israeli accountability and protection to focus instead on recognizing Palestine or resuscitating that dead corpse of Oslo in a so-called two-state solution. This would be another political process that normalizes Israel and marginalizes Palestinian self-determination and a smokescreen for Israeli abuses. That brings us then to Security Council scenarios. Now, the Security Council has the power to deploy an armed force and even to impose it against the will of any country under Chapter 7 of the Charter. But we know that the US, the UK, and France are all genocide complicit states that have the veto power in the Council. That means there are only two possible outcomes if you take it to the Security Council. Either a mandate that pleases the US, acting as Israel's proxy, and therefore would be disastrous for the Palestinian people and could be imposed against the will of the Palestinians under Chapter 7, or the US will veto any meaningful force that is proposed to the Council. So that means the Council cannot be the answer. You may have to start there depending on diplomatic moves in New York, but it will not provide relief. And that's why we're looking at the use of Uniting for Peace under the UN General Assembly. That's the point. The UN, the world doesn't have to surrender to a US veto in the Security Council. The UN General Assembly is empowered when it meets to convene under Uniting for Peace. There are historical precedents for doing so, and they can take extraordinary action. And that's what we're saying. A UN General Assembly resolution under Uniting for Peace could call on states to adopt comprehensive sanctions and a military embargo, to reject the United Nations General Assembly credentials of Israel, as was done with apartheid South Africa, to mandate a criminal tribunal, to reactivate the long dormant anti-apartheid mechanisms to address Israeli apartheid, and for purposes of this conversation, to mandate an armed multinational UN protection force to deploy to Gaza and ultimately to the West Bank, acting on the request of the state of Palestine to protect civilians, and, open the entry points via land and sea, and do all of those things that we said needed to be included. Now, they'll need a 2/3 majority to do so, but Palestine has requested this intervention, so no Chapter 7 action by the Security Council is needed. That means you don't have to worry about this kind of a force becoming a proxy occupation force. because its deployment and its remaining on the ground will be at the discretion of the Palestinians. And very importantly, as affirmed by the World Court in its findings last year, Israel would have no legal right to refuse, to obstruct, or to influence the mission. It does not have a say in the matter, according to the International Court of Justice, because it has no authority, no sovereignty, and no rights in the occupied Palestinian territories. Process is very simple. A proposal will be vetoed in the Security Council, most likely. Any member state that can then call for an emergency special session of the General Assembly under Uniting for Peace. A resolution can be proposed, and many drafts are already circulating. It can be adopted with a two-thirds majority, and then the UN will start soliciting troop contributions from member states to participate and deploy the troop. Now, legally, there are no hurdles. The rules allow for it. There are precedents, as Jill mentioned, the 1956 UN emergency force that was deployed to the Sinai by the same mechanism. But of course, the US and the Israeli regime will use everything in their power to try to prevent first the two-thirds majority by threatening delegations, or to try to water down the text to take out any meaningful content. And we know that the current lawless government in Washington may even threaten sanctions. It has imposed sanctions on the International Criminal Court, on the UN Special Rapporteur, on Palestinian human rights organizations. So it is not beyond that kind of lawless action. And it may even try to obstruct the force once it is mandated. And that's why the majority of member states will need to stay the course in the face of US and Israeli threats. The world needs to get up off its knees to stand up to the Israeli-American access and to its genocide. And global civil society has to be steadfast in its demands for protection and justice. Our job is to make sure there is a glare of public exposure under which states will be forced to vote either for or against protection of the Palestinians during a genocide. None of them will be able to hide behind a US veto, just throwing up their hands and saying, we tried. Once the force is mandated, it can deploy by land, sea, air, accompanied by international media, supported by diplomatic pressure from all of the countries for the perpetrators to step down. So I'll finish there and say, we are in the face of historic atrocities. The international system has failed. Part of the reason it's failed is because it has not had the audacity to use all the power that it has at its disposal, including the mechanism that we are discussing today. We are not naive. Success is not assured. The obstacles are significant, but we know that failure is guaranteed if we don't try, and time is of the essence. Genocide in Gaza, famine in Gaza, the genocide spreading across the West Bank, Israel expanding its military presence across Palestine, and then 18 September marking the end of the one-year deadline set by the General Assembly for further measures. That means the time for us to do this is now. Thank you, Jill.